Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Sylvie Kauffmann. And you stay here.
Good evening. Welcome to the last session of this very busy and hopefully very fruitful day for all of you. We're going to talk about us, Europe, but not only about us, we're going to talk about the United States as well. This panel is called Beyond 2024, a new agenda for transatlantic relations. My name is Sylvie Kauffmann. I'm a foreign affairs columnist and editorial director of the French newspaper Le Monde. And, you know, journalists love transatlantic relations because it gives us a lot to write about. And on November 5, we're going to have a lot to write about with this presidential election. Of course, the problem with US presidential election is that Europeans don't get to vote. Actually, the rest of the world doesn't either. And it's a pity because it is extremely consequential for all of us. So this is what we are going to talk about this evening with an excellent panel. I know moderators always say they have an excellent panel, but this time I really mean it. We have an American speaker, Ambassador Kurt Volker. Who is not the American, please welcome him. It's not the American you have on your program because there have been a few problems of flying. But Ambassador Kurt Volker is, has been ambassador to Ukraine, special envoy to Ukraine, and is a leading expert on US and foreign policy. Then we have Benjamin Haddad. Benjamin Haddad is a member of the French National Assembly. He was recently re-elected at one of our latest snap elections. And he's, I think I have to sit here. So yeah, please. And so he was, and probably is still member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of the Parti Renaissance or Ensemble, the presidential party. Then we have Mark Leonard. Mark Leonard is from the UK. He is the founder and co-founder and director of the great pan-European think tank, European Council on Foreign Relations. And last but not least, we have a speaker from Hungary who happens to be very close to Prime Minister Viktor Orbán because he's his political director. Welcome. And he happens to also be called Orbán, but no relation. And it's Balázs Orbán, Orbán Balázs. Yes, welcome. And thank you very much for joining us, all of you. So maybe I will start. Sorry, just one, a housekeeping detail, the way we are going to proceed. You're probably used to it by now. I'm going to ask a few questions. We're going to have a short discussion between us, and then I will, of course, open the floor to questions. And you will introduce yourself and ask your questions. You can do this either by raising your hand in the classic way, or you can do it online with the Slido app. So maybe I will start with you, Ambassador Volker, since you're the American on the panel. So on November 5, it's at the moment, apparently chances seem to be quite equal for both candidates. So let's take the first option. Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is re-elected to a second term, will Trump 2 be different from Trump 1, whom you saw quite close, I think, and how?
Well, it's a great question. And first off, let me just reiterate, it is an even race right now. We can't make any assumptions about whether it's Trump or Harris. And I would say that we have spent the last month in kind of a honeymoon phase for Kamala Harris, which, as people come back to work in September after the Labor Day holiday, I think will, for the first time, have people start paying attention to the election. Who's who? What do they stand for? Second, I don't think Trump could answer your question, let alone anyone speaking about Trump. I think he is very transactional. I think he's very pragmatic. He's very of the moment, and in many ways will make decisions on the spot and change his mind. So I think, and that was characteristic of the first term, and I think that would be characteristic of the second term as well. That it's going to be that sort of thing.
And about his entourage?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of speculation as to who might be in a Trump administration, and also speculation about what policies they might implement. And there's been a lot of effort by people to promote themselves or to promote their institutions. And for example, the Heritage Foundation, Jim is not here today, so I can say this. The Heritage Foundation came out with this Project 2025. And I could see that. I used to run the McCain Institute. I know the think tank world. I could see what was happening. They had been positioned for decades as a Reaganite think tank. They were losing touch with voters around the country. They were losing donors. So they decided, we're going to become the Trump think tank. We're going to be the MAGA think tank. And we're going to create a program to define what the policies are going to be. No endorsement, no instruction, no request from Trump. It's just this is the way they're going about rebranding themselves. And it largely worked for Heritage as well. They successfully rebranded that way. But of course, surprise, surprise, Trump comes out a month ago and says, what's Project 2025? I have no idea. And it's certainly not going to be the blueprint. You have people, I'll mention the names that come up in the media most often. There's Rick Grinnell, there's Robert O'Brien, there's Keith Kellogg, there's Bridge Colby, there's Mike Pompeo, probably leaving a few out here. This covers a spectrum.
So Mike Pompeo is still around.
Yeah, this covers a spectrum of views. There are some who would be chaos on wheels. There are some who would be neo-isolationist. There are some who would be, I can't think beyond China. And there are some who are very traditional peace through strength. And so you're going to have all of these views surrounding and echoing and bouncing around Trump as it is in the campaign now, if he's also in the White House. I come from the peace through strength side of things. That's the way I look at things. I think it is a sellable case to Trump. Not that it's a slam dunk, but it's a sellable case that to him that a lot of the problems we have right now are because of weakness and lack of resolve and lack of people fearing the capacities of the United States. And so if he wants to settle some of these issues, including Ukraine or the Middle East, first thing you need to do is make people fear what we might do. We have strength and capacity and we might use it. I think he could be sold on that.
Interesting. So Mark, you are actually spending quite a lot of time in Washington because on sabbatical to research these issues. So what is your view on Trump, on a potential Trump 2?
Well, unlike Kurt, I've not worked for former President Trump, so I'm speaking with some humility here. But I do think, and I think his brand is about being unpredictable, and he is definitely going to surprise us in all sorts of different ways. But I do think there's a sort of big structural difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. Trump 1.0 didn't think he was going to win. It was a huge surprise to everyone, but I think most of all himself that he won. And he was an outsider craving recognition, and a lot of the people he appointed were establishment figures from different parts of the Republican establishment. And over time, a lot of them ended up getting chewed up by the system. But there were lots of adults in the room who saw their role as constraining Trump. I think Trump 2.0, at least thought he was going to win during the Republican National Convention. And, you know, as Kurt said, I think it would be a very brave person who put any money on this. I think it's a toss-up now. I think a few weeks ago it looked like the Democrats couldn't win, but now I think it's a toss-up, and it's completely plausible that Trump gets returned as president. And I think now he is somebody who's coming back looking for revenge. And I mean, that's been a kind of central leitmotif of all of his speeches and the way that he's thinking about things.
So that's where it's important for us, right?
He has a political project, which is different from the one he did last time. I think his choice of J.D. Vance as a running mate is kind of very interesting, because he's sort of indicating that he wants the Republican Party to have sorry, I don't think this is working anymore, but a different social base, which is an anti-elitist one, which is working class rather than the sort of country club republicanism. And there will be all of these different people trying to compete for his brain. But I do think that a lot of the ideas which Project 2025 were trying to channel come out of an attempt to read his mind and work out what his frustrations were. And the biggest, most central part of Project 2025 was the war on the administrative state and the attempt to get rid of the adults in the room, to get rid of 50,000 people who were working for the government, who were constraining him in different ways, and to create a counter elite that will run the organization in different ways. Mike, we spent a lot of time talking to different people. Who knows who's going to be in the administration, but trying to understand both what his enmities will be if he is looking for attribution, but also what kind of ideas are out there in the ether. We published a report looking at 6 different scenarios, and they're all pretty scary from a European perspective. On Ukraine, you know, there are lots of talk about some kind of Minsk III version, which doesn't just deprive Ukraine of its territorial integrity, but neutralizes the country and would be a big defeat, not just for Ukraine, but I think for European security if that happened. On NATO, you know, we've had lots of debates about that. There is a lot to be scared of if Trump is re-elected. I don't think the US will leave NATO, but I do think that having him in the White House will significantly weaken NATO. We know what he's going to do on trade. They've talked about introducing a 50% tariff on China and a 10% universal tariff on the rest of the world. So we'll get kind of caught between that. We looked at, in our scenarios, we also looked at what, a Trump policy to make Israel great again might look like for the Middle East. On climate change and energy policy, it's very clear that he wants the US to be the kind of central producer of hydrocarbons in the world, and that there'll be a kind of set of policies which reflect that agenda. And I think there is also a sort of ideological agenda, an attempt to try and reach out to like-minded political forces, and I'm sure Balázs will tell us more about that later on. But I think that there is likely to be a bit more coherence. I think there'll be a more mindful attempt to put people in the administration who will do his bidding rather than get in the way and act as constraints on him. And I don't think that we have necessarily got our head round as Europeans what we need to do to deal with all of those different scenarios collectively. But the other thing I would say is that though there's a lot of euphoria around Kamala Harris and around the Harris campaign, I also don't think that Europeans have necessarily got their head around how challenging a Harris presidency is going to be for us. I think on Ukraine, it will definitely be a lot more palatable and a lot less scary than some of the sort of Trump scenarios, but there will be a shift after the election. In Washington, people don't think that it's likely that Ukraine is going to be able to capture and hold the rest of its territory, and they're sort of thinking about how you move towards some sort of settlement. I think that the Harris campaign is not going to go for a Minsk 3.0. Their goal is to try and put Ukraine into a strong position to settle it, but that is going to be something which is going to be different. I think on China, we are going to find a whole series of policies, whether it's Trump or Harris that are elected, that we have to deal with. And I don't think that we're necessarily thinking about how we can prepare ourselves for what happens, because we're in an interregnum at the moment. But from January next year, there will be a lot of change coming from Washington. And I think that we need to be thinking about it and put ourselves into a good place so that we can defend our interests, but also be good partners to a Harris administration if they are elected, and think about how we Trump-proof a lot of these core policies, particularly around Ukraine, around trade, but in all the other areas I talked about as well.
It's great. So, Benjamin, how is this going to? If we take this concept of strategic autonomy, which used to be so popular in the Elysee, there was the contrarian view was that it would be better to have Trump. In fact, what would happen according to you?
Well, at first, it's great to be here. You mentioned early on that I was re-elected recently, so I'm very glad to be back to doing what I love the most, which is speaking on panels on transatlantic relations, saying that things will not go back to normal and that Europeans should take more responsibility in world affairs. I think we'll probably still be doing this in the next decades. No, look, I mean, I'm being a little cynical, but first I share what you all said, which is that this is clearly a very close election so far. There's the momentum that we see for Kamala Harris, but we lived this in 2016, and so if you look at the polls in the swing states, they're basically in less than 1 point difference right now. But I would like to do like Mark, which is maybe focus on some of the similarities, some of the similar challenges that Europeans will face, whether it's the Harris administration or a Trump administration. Because if you look at the last 4 years, clearly the Biden administration has to be commended for its leadership on supporting Ukraine and bringing together transatlantic allies in the support for Ukraine. But if you look at economic issues, for example, a lot of the Trump tariffs were not lifted by the Biden administration. The Biden administration also put together the IRA to invest massively in the green transition, in the American industry, which was beneficial to the American economy, but did it in a very unilateral way without bringing in European allies at the expense of our industry. I think a lot of this trend towards protectionism, towards focusing on American economic interests, towards other priorities on the world stage, and of course we can think first and foremost of Asia, a lot of this you're going to see whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. What I would hope from Kamala Harris administration is actually not so much speeches about the value of allies, the value of the relationship, and how Europe and NATO should be at the core of US foreign policy, but actually a frank transatlantic conversation about what the US does not want to do anymore, what it doesn't see it as its priority and interest anymore, and what we would like for the other to be doing and focusing on. Because what I fear, and I think a lot of people in Paris fear, is that down the road you have another major crisis in the periphery of Europe or on the European continent, like you had in the Western Balkans in the 90s, where we were unable to stop a genocide on our soil. And we go knocking on Washington's door, and you have policymakers, Democrats like Republicans, who say, we don't see this as a core interest for us. We don't see this as a priority. We have other things to deal with. After all, this is in your neighborhood, so you should be taking care of this. And this would not be an unfair response. This would actually be a very coherent response. Increase your defense spending, take care of yourselves. We have other things to deal with in Asia. Mm-hmm. So instead of being faced with this, and who knows, the migration crisis, the security crisis that might confront us, I hope that with a new administration, and I hope we could do this too with the Trump administration. I fear that it's going to be much more hostile and much more confrontational. But I hope that we could have a very frank conversation about how burden sharing becomes priority sharing between the United States and Europe. And this goes back to your question about strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, however we want to call it. We get too much caught up in the semantics and the theology of this. And I say this as a French, where we love the concepts, but we should focus more on the practicalities and discuss this. It's not about turning our back to the transatlantic relationship or wanting to push the United States away from the continent. It is just about having that conversation. You tell us invest more in defense. That's a very legitimate request. And by the way, in the last few years, because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, you've seen dramatic increase in defense spending. Over the 2 terms of the Macron presidency, will have doubled the defense spending. And I hope that we continue to do this afterwards. But it is about Europeans empowering themselves and having the ability to act on their own if necessary, and if we are in a situation where the United States decides to focus elsewhere.
Balázs, Orbán, you like this concept of strategic autonomy, I understand, and and you also said that you're also of the view that the Europeans have been blindly following this American administration into the war in Ukraine. So, what do you expect? What would you like from the next Trump term, or? You know, Trump has boasted that he would end the war in 24 hours. Do you think this would be the case?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in a very complicated situation because I agree with most of the things which were said by Mark and Benjamin, and I don't want to cause them trouble. But actually, this is the reality about the potential new Trump administration. What I see is that they are much more prepared, focused, and strategically planned than before. And obviously, I think the most obvious example is the war in Ukraine. How, from a policy point of view, how they want to solve that conflict. And this is the point where I disagree with Mark. Obviously, that I think it would be good for Europe because finally somebody is coming and end this, in an American terms, called endless war, and bring peace, which would be much better for Europe as such. And I think that they take it seriously. So American elections are mainly about local domestic issues, but as you see, President Trump and Vice President candidate J.D. Vance, they keep talking about not giving the taxpayers money to foreign issues, but bringing them back home and spending on migration, spending on dealing with inflation crisis, energy crisis, and so on and so on. So I think it's a serious plan on their side. Obviously, we Hungarians are sharing their views on that, and this view is shared by the rest of the world, outside the Western world. I just came back from India, but you keep hearing how the Chinese are communicating, and then I don't raise some comments on some other myth powers outside from the global south. So the rest of the world agrees on that issue, that we should end the war. Only the transatlantic liberal elite, which is until now on the other side. So they take it seriously. The other thing which was mentioned by you as well, Sylvie, that and it's true that it's a French concept, and I think it's very important that in the last 4 years what we experienced, that the European elite was in a Stockholm syndrome with America. Based on the ideological similarities. It's like if we agree on open borders, or if we agree on, I don't know, the woke agenda, or if we agree on how the liberal democracy should be saved, then we obviously share all the policy points. But it's not the case. The Americans are our friends, but they have their own interests, they have their own agenda. And if the European elite is blind, then they will put enough pressure on the European elite to be in an autopilot follow mode. And this is what happened, not just in a war, but trade relationship, how to deal with technological issues, what is happening with the competitiveness of the European companies. So in many fields, what I see and what I keep hearing today as well, European politicians, as they speak and how they formulate their arguments, it goes against the interest of many European countries, and it's not shared by many European people, but that's the political part of it. It's not the interest of many European member states, the policies which are represented by the European elite. And I think Trump and the potential next Trump presidency can have a very positive effect because the European elite can finally, save itself. Yes, save itself from the Stockholm syndrome.
From the Stockholm syndrome.
And and awake in a normal way. So I'm encouraging all these discussions. The one example which is always mentioned, and it was mentioned by the previous panelists as well, is the NATO spending. So Europe is not able to be independent in many decision making because we rely on our American friends on defense. And what the Americans are saying, if I provide defense for you, then why don't you want to have an independent foreign policy or a trade policy?
But so would Hungary be ready to follow the Polish way, for instance, to spend more than 4% of GDP on defense?
Let's hope that we can afford it. Unfortunately, we don't get our money from Brussels, so it's a bit more complicated.
There we go.
But Hungary, since years, spends more than 2% of the GDP on spending. We have a different attitude because we see that a country should always spend 2 times on family policy issues than on military, because that's also part of the military family spending. You have your own children and you invest in new generations. But in general, this is the case. We spend more than 2% on defense from years, and we spend more than 4% on family policies. So Hungary is doing its job. And is ready to do more. And I think if we got the pressure from the Americans that we should do more, it will be the better for Europeans. So we shouldn't complain. We should just catch up.
So regarding Ukraine, and then I will give you the floor, Mr. Volker. Regarding Ukraine, you still think Trump would be able to end the war in 24 hours? And that Harris would just prolong it? Or?
This is what he told me. Okay. And I told him that, Mr. President, if you can make a peace not in 24 hours, but 36 hours, it's also good for us. And he said, okay, but it has to be 24 hours.
Okay, okay. Kurt Volker, maybe you have a point.
Let me just take this question seriously in a different manner as well. So I think what was said by the gentleman is true, that sooner or later, even the Democrats have to realize that this is over. It cannot be continued in a way. And this is why we Hungarians are learning that it doesn't matter who is winning the elections. If we don't change, if we don't get proactive, then America will leave us alone with the problem, which is called Ukraine. Who is going to finance it? Who is going to provide stability there? So it's like, these are the questions which we will face anyhow. So the sooner we start the honest discussion and not the moral part of it, that who is right, who is wrong, who is attacked, who is not attacked, it's obvious. But let's put aside this and focusing on the job, which has to be done by the Europeans anyhow.
Well, there's actually a question being asked on this app on this issue. What real leverage could Trump use that the Biden administration, hasn't, without forcing Ukraine to accept humiliating terms? So please, go ahead.
The first thing I want to do, Balázs, I was nodding along up until a certain point, and if the Trump administration were to leave Europe on its own, Europe would be left with a problem called Russia, not a problem called Ukraine. And that's a big difference. Now, thing is, I don't think that's what's going to happen. If you were to ask someone from the Trump administration who was doing NATO, Trump would say himself, he left NATO stronger than when he found it. When he left his presidency, there was $80 billion plus more of defense spending in Europe. There were more American forces. There were forces further eastward deployed within NATO to shore up the flanks. He had lifted the arms embargo on Ukraine so that they were getting the first lethal defensive weapons, because the Obama administration had a ban in place. As soon as the U.S. did this, we broke the ice. The French did it immediately after the U.S. did. Germans were a little bit slower, and this then didn't lead only to equipment, but to lethal training as well. And I don't think if we had just kept in place the same arms ban and the same lethal ban, I don't think Ukraine could have defended Kyiv in 2022 the way they did in February of 2022. So those are all the things you would get from the Trump first term that they would push back on a lot of these narratives. I want to call your attention to an article that Mike Pompeo and David Urban signed and published in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, which is entitled "The Trump Plan for Ukraine." Now, this is not to say that former President Trump has bought into this. I don't think he'll buy into anything ever. I think he will make up his mind as he goes along. But the argument that Pompeo and Orbán make in this article is that you need to reestablish strength, that we are in Ukraine today partly because of the weakness shown in Afghanistan and the chaos that was there, which convinced Putin and Xi and others that it's game on, we can do whatever we want. And some of the things that I think are realistic that Trump could do that are in that list of things are increasing oil and gas exports to press, based off, make America even bigger energy superpower, but push down prices. He would realign the US with Saudi Arabia and try to realign Israel and Saudi Arabia against Iran. That would also facilitate getting Saudi Arabia to help with energy prices. He would probably not support any increased US military assistance to Ukraine, but probably would support an almost unlimited fund of loans. You can borrow whatever you want as long as you spend it on US defense articles. And I think that would be very realistic. And as far as negotiations goes, remember, it's the current desire of the current administration to push Ukraine towards negotiations to have some kind of settlement. And the problem with this, again, is Russia. Russia has zero interest in giving anything up. They have their absolutist ambition of eliminating Ukraine. And eliminating Ukraine as a national identity, reestablishing a Russian empire. That's going to be true under Trump as well. Whether or not he wants to push for a negotiation, Putin's going to be Putin until he is confronted with a situation where he cannot, and he knows he will only weaken Russia if he persists. That is not the case today. And I'll just close on this, but the Ukrainians are extremely grateful for all of the assistance that the US and Europe have given them. They wouldn't have survived without it. They know that. It's been really substantial. At the same time, they are incredibly frustrated because it has been slow, a half step at a time, too late. And even today, as we're sitting in this room, the US policy on Ukraine is, well, don't fire our missiles deep inside Russian territory. The Ukrainians think this is nuts. And they're in an existential fight to save their country. Their view is that we're grateful for what the US is giving us. We don't want to tick them off. But if we do what the US is telling us, we're going to be defeated. So we better come up with something else.
Okay. Benjamin wants to jump in, and Mark too, and time is running out. I have to warn you, so then we go to the floor.
Well, so quickly, because to bounce back on what Balázs said earlier, I really agree with one point where he said that Ukraine is going to be Europe's problem. It's on our continent, it's on our border, it's an aggression against European values in our system, in our security architecture, first and foremost. I don't think we draw the same conclusions from this idea that Ukraine is Europe's problem, because you're maybe more optimistic about what, or at least from Mike Pompeo's article, what a Trump policy on Ukraine could be. But if we are faced with a very awkward situation where tomorrow a Trump presidency decides to withdraw support for Ukraine and push towards a settlement that we find unsatisfactory, and we find submitting to Russian aggression, maybe preparing the next one, what do we do, Europeans, if President Zelensky comes to Brussels and pleads for continued support and asks European, let's not accept the American plan, please continue to help us, please continue to give us weapons, please continue to send funds, and we'll keep on fighting? I mean, these are the questions when you talk about strategic autonomy. This might be a very first test in 6 months. Are we ready in terms, first financially, in terms of weapons? I don't think so. Are we ready intellectually? I don't think a lot of people are asking this question out in the open. If the United States decide, and by the way, this almost happened a few months ago because Congress was blocked. This happened a year earlier than we thought, and then we gained some time
With consequences on the ground.
with dramatic consequences on the ground, of course, that we still feel, by the way, today. I so much agree, by the way, what you said, which is that if we had started giving 2 years ago what we're giving Ukrainians now, the F-16 that they're finally using, the tanks, the long-range missiles, if we give them the green light to strike into the Russian territory, just at the basis from which Russians are firing missiles at Ukrainian cities, maybe the counteroffensive would have been quite different, and maybe the situation on the ground would not be different. But I'm just asking this question: is tomorrow Zelensky goes to Brussels, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, and Budapest and asks for continued help? What do we do? I think if we're unable to do so and we give in to, an American, a Trump-led Minsk III, I think that will be a terrible moment for European identity and security.
Mark?
I think what we're starting to have now is a debate about how this ends and what victory and what defeat looks like. And I think we need to have a much more granular discussion about that. Because what's frightening about the Trump peace plan is not the idea of peace. I think we all want peace, and we want peace to be as quick as possible, and we want it to be sustainable. I mean, we've got as much of more of an interest than most people in the world to have peace in our continent. But the danger with what we've seen of the Trump peace plan is that it doesn't look very sustainable. It's not just that Ukraine will lose territory, but he's also seems to be signing up to other Russian objectives about the demilitarization of Ukraine and Ukrainian neutrality, and Ukraine being kept outside of NATO and outside of the European Union. And that doesn't feel like a very stable settlement. If Ukraine doesn't have security guarantees, if it is not able to choose a kind of geopolitical route, it both encourages further Russian aggression towards Ukraine, but also creates a template which could be developed towards other countries. The difficulty is that, we are very good at talking about victory and supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, but the political constraints on doing what one would need to do in order for Ukraine to win against Russia, I think, are huge, and we've seen that being tested very dramatically now. So I think in our minds we need to work out what a hierarchy of interests is, and that's a debate which is also taking place within Ukraine. And I think we've done some polling in it, and it seems to me that, when you poll Ukrainians about whether they're willing to concede territory for peace, most people are against that at the moment. But the one thing which they care about even more than territory is their freedom to be a democracy and to choose their geopolitical orientation. And it does seem to me like, obviously as Europeans, we're never going to recognize Russian aggression and Russian sovereignty over Ukrainian territory. But at the same time, from our perspective, I do think it's more important to have a Ukraine that can choose its geopolitical future, that feels secure, that is part of the European Union and NATO eventually, and that is more important than whether Ukraine controls 80%, 85%, 95%, or 100% of its territory. And that it's much more important to preserve that freedom and of Ukraine to choose its own future than to get totally hung up on exactly how much of its territory it gets back. And if we're clear about that, then I think you can go into ideas of having a settlement in a much kind of stronger way, because you want Ukraine to be empowered to be as strong as possible in whatever settlement is developed. But my colleague Jana Pulierin and Claudia Mayor have just written a brilliant piece for Internationale Politik in Germany, which has also just come out in English, but where they kind of look both at the kind of nightmare scenario, but then also what it means for Europeans and for people in the West if you want to avoid that nightmare scenario happening. And that has big implications for us in terms of how we think about the EU enlargement process, how we think about NATO. But for me, that does seem to be a more helpful debate than some of the more theological discussions that we've been having, particularly if you look at the really dire situation that Ukraine has found itself in over the last period of time, with this uncertainty about what kind of support it can get, with the kind of grinding success of the Russians in the and their ability to regain territory, and the big struggle that Ukraine has to get its territory back. I think we need to have a different debate here, and we need to do it urgently, because I think things are going to shift in Washington after the elections, whatever happens in November.
Yeah, I think that's for sure. Yes, Mr. Orbán, maybe you want to respond, and there is a question to you, and then promise we go to the room. We still have 10 minutes. What would Hungary have to change on its Ukraine war policy if Harris wins?
Probably nothing.
Okay.
Probably nothing, because we have a policy which is, I would say, 80-90% backed by the Hungarian people. I know that in this room people are emotionally involved. We Hungarians and the Hungarian political elite, the elites on the right side, is more realist. So our position is not pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian. It's different. We see that this is not our war. The Ukrainians have every right to fight back. It's their sovereign decision. But we have also an opportunity to make our sovereign decision, and we don't want to see it as our war. I know it's emotionally shocking for this audience, but you can see the word in...
Not sure it's only emotional.
You can see this conflict in this way, and I have to say that the rest of the world sees this conflict in this way, whether we like it or not. So what I see as a realist, outside observer, then we are having this war for like 2.5 years. We spend a lot of money on that. And what is happening now? More than 500,000 people died on both sides. Russia has more territory than they had when they started the war. Millions of people left Ukraine. Ukrainian economy is collapsed without the support of the West. It's not a sustainable country anymore. And the European economy is suffering. And there is a realistic risk of further escalation of the conflict and turning into a NATO-Russia direct confrontation. So what are the strategic gains? Why we are doing that? So my position is that from this realistic analysis, we should change. And the sooner we change, and the more Europeans we are proactive on that shifting and coming up with a new strategy and a completely different approach, it's better for us, because if we are not doing so, then again, this entire discussion will be dominated by Americans, and we will left alone with this conflict. And I think what I keep hearing from Washington, from all sides, is that in the long term, the United States of America, it doesn't matter which administration, but they have to answer to the question why it makes sense to push Russia into the hand of Chinese and China, while they have a strategic conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, and there is a serious conflict around the Middle East. Why it makes sense? And I think that in the long term, United States of America will have an answer that it makes no sense. And then there is the answer, and that's the last sentence for Kurt, then the American-Russian agreement on the security architecture of Eurasia will be recreated. And I hope that it will be recreated with the Europeans, not without the Europeans. But for this, we have to act and change policy.
Okay, Benjamin, I cannot give you the floor, I'm sorry, because we are almost out of time, and I want to take at least 2 questions. So one here, and the gentleman over there.
Hello.
So please, lady. Yeah.
I'm Mariam Lambert. I'm actually a former diplomat, European civil servant from Belgium. I'm not Ukrainian. I agree with you, actually, about this is not, we shouldn't put emotion, we should be realistic. What I did is actually spend 2 years in the frontline villages. I'm going back next week, and I saw the realistic situation. I stopped having emotion for 2 years. As a father, if tomorrow your children are being deported, tortured, raped, because this is what we talk about when we talk about peace, is accepting the fact that people who will be staying in occupied territories will be deported, tortured, and children will be adopted by a Russian family. this is what we are talking about when we ask for peace. So I'm talking to you without emotions, realistically. What do you suggest as a peace plan? Thank you.
Okay, and we take a second question.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Free Russia Foundation based in Brussels. A question also to Balázs Orbán. When
I'm
you
always
talk
the
to-
advocate of the devil. Sorry about
When you talk to MAGA Republicans, including, of course, former President Trump, do you ever talk about China? And what transpires from this? I mean, we all know that MAGA Republicans admire Hungary for many reasons, but I don't think that's the case for Hungary's China policy.
Sorry, I don't want to eat
Go
up
ahead.
the time.
The
and
questions are
attention.
directed to
Sorry
you.
about that. So you know, if I talk about peace, I mean peace. And if you have peace, children are not tortured. People are not killed. This is what it means, peace. So I think it's never, I mean, really try to leave some maneuvering space for ourselves. We cannot openly and seriously talk against peace. Peace is always an option, not just because we are Christian, but because that's good for the people. I think that many people do talk about peace, but they don't take it seriously. Conflicts like this, where there is no clear winning and losing side, never in history. I can give you many examples. Never end like this. There is a peace plan, and please sign it. And then the losing side is signing it. We were Hungarians in this situation after the Second World War, but it's not the case now. So in this situation, the peace starts always with small minor steps. First, restore communication channels. When my prime minister started the peace mission, immediately got a huge blow on that. You know, how do we want to solve the problem without communication? So first, restore communication channels. Then try to figure out a short-term ceasefire. Short-term ceasefire, as it is happening in the Middle East. So this is why I don't understand the Western logic. You know, Western politicians can argue in favor of ceasefire in the Middle East, but it's impossible and it's betraying of our moral values if we raise the same points in Ukraine. Come on, take ourselves more seriously. This is how it is done. Short-term ceasefire, sometimes it collapses, sometimes not. And use this as a window of opportunity to start the very long negotiations which were mentioned by Kurt. It's going to be hard, it's going to be painful on all sides, it's going to be complicated, but the sooner we start it, it will be much better, and more children will be saved from that. And the second question to the gentleman. We keep talking about many issues and also about China. What bothers me is that the Graham Allison book, that if you have a shifting world order and an emerging power and a hegemon, then what happens? Whether there is a conflict or a war, which is managing the power change, or whether they are able to have an agreement. And what I hope is that America and China, the two big guys in the room, will be adult and serious enough to avoid confrontation. And this shifting of a global power or a new kind of equilibrium, whether we call it, whatever we call it, will not end up in a third world war. And this is what, from a Hungarian point of view, is the most important aspect of it. And I think that we, with the Trump people and the MAGA people, we all are national conservatives. If you are a national conservative, then you do believe that every nation has the right to have its own policy based on its own national interest, which is mainly decoded its own geography, its own size, its own history, its own socio-cultural background. So if you're not a liberal, but you are a national conservative, you actually can see the world that there are different nations with different policies, different priorities, and you don't have to hate each other for that, but you have to accept it as a reality, and on this, try to make win-win agreements.
Well, I'm terribly sorry because we are having an interesting discussion and we were actually going a little bit away from Ukraine, but time is really up and there is an important event waiting for you now, which is the gala dinner. So this was the last session. For those of you who are invited to the gala dinner, the bus is taking you to the venue will be ready in 10 minutes now, 7:10 from the hotel entrance. The program at this stage continues tomorrow at 9:10 with a discussion on competing vision for the future. And I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the speakers for this very interesting discussion, and thank you for the audience. Thank you.